For Pacifica Radio, December the 12th, 2024. I'm Scott Horton. This is Antiwar Radio. All right, y'all, welcome to the show. It is Antiwar Radio. I'm your host, Scott Horton. I'm the editorial director of Antiwar.com, and I'm the author of the new book, Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. You can find my full interview archive, more than 6,000 of them now, going back to 2003, at scotthorton.org and at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show, and also all other podcatchers and video sites and things out there. Just look for the Scott Horton Show interview feed there. And you can follow me on X, as they call it now, if you dare, at Scott Horton Show. All right, and welcoming back to the show, it's Antiwar.com's opinion editor, Kyle Anzalone. He also is the host, not just of the show Conflicts of Interest, which is great, but also the new Kyle Anzalone Show, which is also available on every podcatcher in the world. Welcome back to the show. How you doing, Kyle?
Doing great, Scott. Thanks for having me back on.
Really happy to have you here, although what a bunch of bad news to talk about. I don't know if we'll get to anything else after Syria, but what in the world is going on in Syria, Kyle Anzalone of Antiwar.com?
Yeah, Scott, this is really unbelievable what we have seen in Syria over the past 2 weeks with the very rapid crumbling of the Syrian government army. It seemed that Assad had lacked some of his allied forces that he had over the past decade or so, and his army did not stand up against this offensive that was conducted by this group called HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And of course, that's just a rebranded al-Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda in Syria. And as has been all along, a guy named Mohammed Abu al-Jolani is the leader of the HTS, al-Nusra Front, or al-Qaeda in Syria, and that's now who controls Damascus. And this is absolutely infuriating, Scott. I feel like I've been listening to you on KPFK or on your show for a decade now saying, what is the U.S. doing with this dirty war in Syria? Why are we backing all these Syrian rebel groups? Don't they know that they're going to end up with Jolani in Damascus? And now that's what's happened.
It's amazing, isn't it? This is one benefit of being an old man, is that I've been doing this long that, yeah, just check the timeline. I've been on KPFK since 2010, so, yep, covered it all right at the time, the whole time on these airwaves. And then, yeah, I mean, this is really no different than if it was bin Laden himself or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State. And, you know, he has had a strategy, even including back then, of playing nicer with the West, sucking up to the West, playing a strategic game to send more moderate people to meet with the Americans to accept their cash and weapons and this kind of thing. That's all it ever was a tactic. William Van Wagenen especially showed there is no free Syrian army. It always was al-Nusra that was dominant this whole time. And he showed that in his great journalism we published at the Institute. And that's William Van Wagenen, everyone, who writes 70,000-word essays, histories of this stuff, and has a new book coming out soon. And so, okay, anybody driving their truck down the 405's got to be thinking that these guys don't know what they're talking about, because Joe Biden might be the worst president since the last guy or the guy before that. But there's no way that he would just outright support a bunch of bin Ladenite terrorists taking over Syria. Would he?
Yeah, Scott, that's exactly what he did, and in 2 administrations. This all started as a dirty war under the Barack Obama administration around 2010, 2011, when after they had completed the regime change against Gaddafi, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, or the veterans from al-Qaeda in Iraq, looted Gaddafi's stockpiles, and then the U.S. funneled them with their weapons from Libya into Syria, where they hijacked the Arab Spring uprising there, which was a protest movement against the Assad government and his cruelty, but was aimed at bringing reforms to Syria and getting more freedom of speech, not being thrown into a political prison or into one of Assad's jails as soon as you speak out against the government. That's what the people were looking for, but it was ultimately hijacked by Jolani and his band of Al Qaeda thugs, because as we see in conflict zone after conflict zone, Scott, the people who are the most ideologically committed, that are willing to go to the furthest extremes, those like the Islamic State, Al Qaeda in Iraq, the Taliban, that are willing to commit horrific acts, are the ones that end up getting a lot of power in these chaotic situations. And so for years and years under the Obama administration, we directly backed al-Jolani and his men. Now, during the Trump administration, Trump canceled the Timber Sycamore program, what the CIA was doing to bring arms to those groups. But at the same time, we allowed our NATO ally Turkey to act as a protectorate of Jolani and his men when the Syrian government, backed by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, were at their absolute peak in, from 2015 to 2018 or 19 or so. They probably could have gone through the Idlib province of Syria and rooted out Jolani and his men, but they were prevented from doing so by the Turks and their status in the NATO alliance, which means war with the Americans. And so with that, on top of the U.S. controlling about a third or a quarter of Syrian territory, refusing to let Syria get, the food products from there, the energy, the resource money from that area, Syria, that we are occupying, and then the sanctions campaign against Assad, all really helped Jolani to eventually, have the momentum needed to take Syria and Damascus and run Assad out of town.
Yeah. Now, it's amazing that part of this story is that Donald Trump, on 3 different occasions, ordered the military to withdraw from Syria. And they ended up just saying, no, we're not doing that. And he ended up saying, oh, all right then. And one of the times the Secretary of Defense resigned over it, and then Trump backed down a week later anyway. James Mattis quit over it. And then, we still have him there to this day. And it's got to be one of the things about Donald Trump that drives the rest of Washington crazy, is that he says things that they're only supposed to do but not say. Like, let's steal all their oil and wheat so that we can have it, not them, and stuff like that. You're not supposed to say that, Mr. President, for God's sake. But that is what they're doing, right?
Yeah, that's been the absolute policy. And on top of that, Scott, it's also been the policy to prevent any construction material from entering Syria. They're intentionally impoverishing the people of Syria to the point where in recent years, there's actually been babies freezing to death during the winter. I have to imagine that had a lot to contribute to Assad's ultimate demise. The fact that he, for ruling Damascus, really wasn't in charge of Syria. He couldn't import. He had no capability to stop the Israelis from bombing his country once or twice a week for a decade. I mean, this bombing campaign that has gone on and on and on, not only from the Americans, of course, but also the Israelis, hitting Syrian government targets again and again and again. Mm-hmm. I mean, what kind of country and what kind of ruler are you of a country if you don't even have control over your own airspace or your own economy, your own ports?
Yeah. Yeah, it's been, when they say Syria, it's like quote unquote Syria, what was left of it. Now there's nothing left of it now. So what do you think is going to happen next?
Well, Scott, it looks like Israel, the U.S., and Turkey are setting in on what remains of Syria like hungry vultures, just going to rip off and take all the pieces that they can. Turkey, of course, our NATO ally, in the U.S., are really at odds now over what we're going to do in Syria. The U.S. policy after the rise of the Islamic State, our more overt policy has been to bat the Syrian Kurds, which we call the SDF, or the Kurdish call the YPG, which is an offshoot of the Kurdish Turkish group, the PKK, and that is labeled as a terrorist group by both the U.S. and Turkey. And so the U.S. has this very difficult situation where we've made some very big promises to the Kurds, and there's people within the U.S. government who may have a lot of influence in the Trump administration, like Lindsey Graham, who's now calling for the U.S. to invade more to protect the the Kurds, I guess, mostly from Turkey, but he's also warning about the extremist threat in Damascus, seeing that as a main threat to our Kurdish allies in Syria. And so I have no idea what the Trump administration policy is going to look like, but I think at least for the next few months, the Biden administration is going to do what they can to walk the very difficult tightrope between not upsetting Turkey too much and not completely abandoning our Kurdish allies. Already this week, we demanded that the Kurds finally withdraw to east of the Euphrates River, and we forced them out of the city of Manbij, saying that we would no longer protect them. And in fact, in the chaos of that fighting, apparently the Kurds accidentally downed one of our drones, believing it was a Turkish drone. And so there's, I think, some fighting to come, particularly in northern Syria, in the areas east of the Euphrates River, while Israel seems interested in pushing north from the Golan Heights, particularly along Syria's border with Lebanon. And I'm sure that has a lot to do with, the what their aspirations are in southern Lebanon, as far as against Hezbollah, and particularly even maybe taking territory.
It's amazing to see, the Israelis just bombing the Syrian Navy at port and bombing, major weapons installations all across the country. And then you have neocons, the very same ones who are, and I mean literal ones, not figurative, but like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, for example. Dan McAdams was telling me he saw where one of their guys was saying, well, geez, you can't let these weapons fall into the hands of these terrorists. It's like, which terrorists are those? And of course, he's implying that actually these weapons were safe in the hands of Assad. He wasn't attacking Israel with them. But these guys that we're celebrating just killed Assad and overthrew his government, and we know are about to massacre all these minorities and everything. We can't let these weapons fall into their hands. Are you crazy? What a world.
I think Israel has carried out 500 plus airstrikes in Syria now since the fall of Assad, Scott, which, we had Joe Biden and even Benjamin Netanyahu declaring what a great day it was for the Syrian people and freedom and all this, that Assad fell. And yet it seems the war has picked up in intensity far higher than when Assad and the lines were frozen, compared to now where the country is just being absolutely bombarded.
It's amazing. It's unbelievable. Hey, y'all, let me tell you about Robertson Roberts Brokerage, Inc. Nobody trusts the U.S. dollar anymore. Foreign governments are stocking up on gold instead of $100 bills. One, they know they need to, and two, that means you need to, too. Interest rates are up, but for some reason, not much for savings accounts. Park your money there and watch Uncle Joe Biden just counterfeit its value away. You can see how the Fed is afraid to raise rates to beat inflation for fear of popping the current bubbles, at least before the election. So more inflation it will continue to be. Gold is your shield against monetary and price inflation, just like it always has been. Now, Tim Fry and the guys over at Robertson Roberts are recommending gold over silver since the world's almost 200 governments are putting their own pressure on the price, which should help everyone else who makes similar calls on their own. Of course, Robertson Roberts can help you with platinum, palladium, and silver, as well as gold. Don't let the Fed and the war party inflate all your savings away. Look up Robertson Roberts at rrbi.co. That's rrbi.co. Hey, y'all, you should sign up for my Substack. It's scotthortonshow.substack.com. And if you do that, you'll get the interviews a day before everybody else. But not only that, they'll be free of commercials. How do you like that? Pretty good, huh? scotthortonshow.substack.com. Hey, y'all, libertasbella.com is where you get Scott Horton Show and Libertarian Institute shirts, sweatshirts, mugs, and stickers and things, including the great Top Lobsters designs as well. See, that way it says on your shirt why you're so smart. Libertas Bella, from the same great folks who bring you ammo.com for all your ammunition needs, too. That's libertasbella.com. Hey, y'all got kids or nephews or anything? You know about the Tuttle Twins books, right? Libertarian lessons about life, liberty, truth, and the state. It's really great stuff. And hey, did you guys know I'm a Tuttle Twin? Or, well, I'm a character in their world now. Skater Scott, local vert dog and anti-government know-it-all. They introduced me in a short book last year, and I hear they're going to develop my character's story a bit more in the future. Cool, right? Anyway, they're now celebrating 10 years and having sold millions of these books. And now they're giving away a free magazine at TuttleTwins.com/10years. There's no shipping charge, and they're not going to ask for your credit card. It's just a free magazine.
The gimmick is that inside the magazine, they've got a really great deal to get all the books. The best deal they've ever offered, which you will certainly want to take them up on. So go to TuttleTwins.com/10 years for your free magazine, and someday, hopefully soon, you and your kids will be reading all about the libertarian antics of cartoon me, along with all my new pals. That's TuttleTwins.com/10 years.
Okay, it's Antiwar Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Kyle Anzalone from Antiwar.com. Let me make sure that I think I understand you here. So, the United States supports our NATO ally Turkey, which in supporting al-Qaeda terrorists, so-called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is just al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, years later now, taking over the country. Israel also supports them, and all sides cheering for the overthrow of Assad and the fall of the Ba'athist government there. And then immediately, America has a problem because we're backing the Kurds in the east, who the Turks would very much like to cleanse and take all their territory and are their avowed enemies. So then we have to protect our Kurdish allies from the Turks. But then, as you're saying, America, you're implying at least, going back to history, America always betrays the Kurds, these ones and those ones all over the place. And so they're saying at least you're going to have to withdraw behind the Euphrates River if we're going to even... And I doubt it's a very sincere promise. They're going to definitely protect them from the Turks. Maybe they will. While at the same time, Israel also is supporting the al-Qaeda takeover of Damascus, but they're bombing the hell out of what's left of the Ukrainian government there. And, I did a debate. Hey, everybody, I'm kind of proud of it. I don't know. Look it up on the YouTube if you want. It's not on my channel. I'm not selling it. I debated Wesley Clark, the 4-star general, the other day. And at the beginning, I was asked, he let me go first on Syria, so I went off about al-Qaeda's taking over and it's a horror show. And Clark said, well, at least they're leaving the former state intact. We've advised them to leave the former state intact. Maybe they're learning from our mistake in Iraq War II in dissolving and de-Ba'athifying the government, dissolving the army. And then the next day, Israel starts carpet bombing them. So if they don't have Douglas Feith there to make Paul Bremer dissolve the Ba'athist regime and its Syrian Arab army, then the Israeli Air Force will just come and liquidate it that way. And so what do they call it? The mistake of Iraq War II? They're deliberately replicating it here. There will be no state in Syria. It'll be carved up, and I guess whatever is not outright seized by Israel or quote unquote protected by America will be up to the Turks, and then a bunch of warring tribes of bin Ladenites and their victims, right? And then I wonder if America is going to at some point have to invade and fight the bin Ladenites. Seems almost inevitable. I don't know.
Yeah, Scott, this is almost unbelievable to say, but I think maybe a better parallel for Syria isn't Iraq, but Libya, where once Gaddafi was gone, you had essentially a completely failed state. You have a couple different warlords now who have essentially consolidated power, but at one point ISIS held a significant swath of territory in the south of Libya. There's still no real government control, or they're I don't even think really part of one of the two main factions in the north that are vying for power. And so I think we could see a very similar situation in Syria, where there's the Mediterranean coast where the Alawites live, and that's where of course with the religion of Assad, and that's where the Russian military bases are. So maybe that ends up being a small state. And then of course you have a large swath of Syria that's an Arab population that may back or at least be okay with living under the Turkish al-Jolani rule. And then you have a large area of Syria that's Kurdish dominated. And it seems like the U.S. is at least not going to let al-Jolani and the Kurds or the Turks come and wipe out those Kurds. And so, I mean, it seems like there's a recipe for essentially just endless war here, Scott, and maybe never again a Syrian state.
Well, I wonder how much pressure there will be in the United States on Trump to get out and or support for him if he wants to do so. And I wonder how many liberals and leftists would be willing to cross the aisle to support the decision that he could make to withdraw. Although remember last time what stopped him over and over again, it wasn't just the military. And in fact, The headlines here are kind of ridiculous. If you Google this up, you will find a lot of news stories. And I think particularly in 2018, when he tried to order the troops out, that said this is a betrayal of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And because it was Israel that needed the United States to continue to occupy eastern Syria, they were essentially hiding behind the Kurds as a PR smokescreen.
Yeah, and that is my kind of concern, Scott, where I don't think Trump would leave. I think there will be two kind of forms of pressure. The Lindsey Graham types will say that we can't abandon our Kurdish allies after they've helped us all this time. We had to stay there to protect them without ever really mentioning that we have to protect them from our NATO allies, Turkey. And then I think the other argument, and this is probably going to be the more persuasive one, is that Syria was a massive victory for the United States. Never talk about the fact that Al-Qaeda won the war. What they're going to say is that we fractured the Shia crescent in the Middle East. Iran can no longer ship weapons to southern Lebanon, and that is the biggest victory that we could possibly imagine, and we have to exploit it to the absolute furthest degree possible and never, ever withdraw our presence from Syria, because then one day Iran could possibly reestablish their land bridge from Tehran to Beirut, and we cannot possibly allow that to happen. And so therefore we have to stay forever.
Yeah. And now look, this goes right back to the heart of the issue. And I know it's complicated, but sometimes things make it seem easier to understand. Like it was a controversy on the right this week where Ben Shapiro, who's somehow the self-appointed leader of the conservative movement in America, said, yeah, a lot of Christians will probably be killed and stuff like that. But you got to understand what's so crucial here is that this is a disruption in Iranian power. Hezbollah and Iran are now weakened, and that's what really matters for Israel, of course. And it came across as very crass, and a lot of people on the right really reacted against it, because it's not just that a lot of Christians and Shiites and Alawites and others are going to be killed, but by bin Ladenites, by the, you can't even say descendants, right? It's not like it's their sons, it's the guys from the same organization what knocked down the towers.
Yeah.
And
Giuliani.
And attacked us a lot of other times besides that, too.
Yeah, and Scott, I just want to emphasize that, as you said, this is a generation later. Giuliani is a man who saw the 9/11 terrorist attack and was inspired to fight on behalf of Al-Qaeda, on behalf of the terrorists. That's who he is. He rose up through the ranks of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and formed Al-Qaeda in Syria in coordination with the Al-Qaeda leadership and Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State. This man is a jihadist lunatic, and that should frighten Americans. When we see his band of thugs looting the Syrian central bank, who knows where that money is going? And we know that even though Israel is carpet bombing a lot of Syrian territory, I'm sure these guys have picked up guns and tanks and all kinds of explosives and other ammunition, maybe shoulder-fired anti-aircraft systems and things like that could pose real threats to Americans and other Westerners all over the globe. I think this is something that we should really be concerned about, that Al-Qaeda won the war in Syria, and now Giuliani has the remnants of the Syrian state under his control, at least for the time being. And even if he is somewhat reformed, Scott, you have to imagine that a lot of the followers who have been with him all the way through Al-Qaeda and Iraq, the rise of the Islamic State and things like this, these people haven't all give up their international jihad, and they're going to profit off the money, and they're going to have access to the guns and the, Syrian state to plot their next attack on the West.
Yeah, I've been feeling like my book, Time to End the War on Terrorism, is really kind of out of date. It came out after the war on terrorism more or less is over, right before Biden was sworn in. And now here we are again, just starting all over again with this. And the irony that America and Israel are back on the side of the bin Ladenites, and that we, maybe not Israel, so far there's no examples of Israel being targeted, but there are plenty of examples of Europeans and Americans being killed by bin Ladenites, radicalized by these wars, for them and against them. Sometimes America, Britain, and Saudi support them. Sometimes we stab them in the back. Sometimes they get angry about other things that we're doing. And I'm not a big false flag, 9/11 guy. I think that that's the consequence of the blowback and the backdraft of America pretending like they can always control these mercenaries, these terrorists that they train and unleash on their Russian and Shiite enemies. And in March or April 2011, you had the first attack by, maybe it was in 2012, the first attack against a Jewish synagogue in Brussels by a veteran of the bin Ladenites fighting in Syria, who was already spreading into Europe. Just as European Muslims were going there to fight, there were Muslims either there already or traveling there to attack Western targets. And we saw this with Omar Mateen in the United States and the San Bernardino attack. Forget the guy's name. So the terror war ain't so simple, and it ain't over. We're starting all over again. I don't know how Trump's going to handle this, but it's going to be bad.
Yeah. And if Syria is now a huge tinderbox, Scott, the war in genocide, the Israeli genocide in Gaza is certainly just a massive flare that will light that fire.
And you know what? Finish up with that and Lebanon too. And the threat posed to Lebanon possibly.
Yeah, well, I mean, the situation in Gaza, Scott, is absolutely horrific. From the last update I gave you, there's probably not too much difference. They're still carrying out the general's plan in the northern Gaza Strip. They're destroying every building. They're not letting.
Wait, tell us, what is the general's plan?
This is an ethnic cleansing plan that Israel had a few former generals roll out, and it basically calls for sealing off first the northern half of the Gaza Strip and either forcing all the civilians to leave or starving them out, or at a certain point in time, they're going to declare that anybody who remains in northern Gaza is a terrorist and they will all be marked for death. But, day after day, you see these videos of hundreds, if not thousands of Palestinians. You could tell they're starving. They're tired. They're dirty. They're barely able to carry their kids and their things on their back. And they're being marched out in front of Israeli tanks out of their home kilometers south into the rest of the Gaza Strip, where, by the way, Israel's still bombing. It's not like they're just destroying the northern Gaza Strip here. Dave DeCamp at Antiwar.com documents this day in and day out. They're hitting the main areas of Gaza City and the Al-Mawasi camp where the Palestinians are with airstrikes. There's people living in tents or just in the open ground, and Israel is dropping bomb after bomb after bomb on them. The war in Lebanon is scaled back from the October when Israel really ramped it up. It was late September, early October. They really escalated their number of strikes, but it's not too much far off of what they've been doing for the since October 7th, which is daily, if not a few times a day. They're conducting strikes in different areas of Lebanon, often hitting civilians. A lot of medical personnel has been killed, in part because Israel is doing the Obama-era signature or double tap strikes, where after they bomb a target, they wait 10 or 15 minutes and then kill the first responders coming in as well. And so the situation in Lebanon is also horrific. Israel isn't abiding by the ceasefire. It seems that right now Hezbollah largely is.
Well, and so back to the Gaza Strip and the terror wars. I think, obviously, the argument inside the jihadist group since Afghanistan has been who to target next. Usually it depends on where they actually are. Syria, obviously, is fertile ground. And there have been times where they decided that they'd be wise not to attack the West as long as the West is supporting them. But then at the very same time, America is aiding and abetting Israel's merciless slaughter of the Palestinians. And this is one of the major motivations for the September 11th attack. Not just rage against it, but a determined plan to bring the United States to the Middle East, bring them back, make them fight a war on the ground, in the sand, and go bankrupt there the long way, the hard way, until the empire finally calls it quits and comes all the way home so they can have their way. That was Al-Qaeda's strategy, to attack us, to cause a worse war. And why? Because otherwise the United States would continue to abet the Israelis in their merciless persecution and land theft from the Palestinians. And so what can we expect except for random kooks? It only takes one. And with 3 or 5, any team of men could cause tremendous damage in this country with even light weapons before they could be stopped. And America's lousy with light weapons. Not that I'm against it, but I'm just saying maybe everybody needs to start carrying theirs, because there's dark times ahead here. I'm not saying in every town and every city, but there will be attacks. It's virtually a certainty.
Absolutely, Scott. And if, not even weapons, just U-Haul trucks or anything like that, they're all over the place, can be turned into weapons against us. And, hopefully we've learned our lesson over the past few decades, but when Joe Biden's sins come home and Americans start to die from his policies, my guess is that Trump is going to make the same mistake that George W. Bush did and just, like a raging bull, charge back into the Middle East and, commit his crimes all over again.
Well, this has been another cheerful episode of Antiwar Radio here on 90.7 KPFK. Thank you very much, Kyle Anzalone, for your expertise today. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Scott.
All right, you guys, that is the great Kyle Anzalone. He's our opinion editor at antiwar.com, the most important project on the internet, as you might infer. And I'm Scott Horton. This is Antiwar Radio. I'm here for you every Thursday from 2:30 to 3 on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA. See you next week.